So God does have a sense of humor. But at the age of 17, the one thing I was absolutely certain about was Christ is God. He founded the church. He established the church as a teaching authority. And at the age of 17, I was absolutely certain that whatever the Pope said was correct. He couldn't make a mistake. And that is still, I think, the basic sentiments of Catholics even today. And this is why there's so much confusion that when the Holy Father says things that don't gel, we become uncomfortable because we have this instinctive sentiment that God does speak to us by his vicar. And I would encourage you to continue to hold to that faith, that belief, because God does speak to us through his vicar. The conditions under which he speaks to us and which we're bound to accept, of course, are restricted, and this we call papal infallibility. But whatever else the Holy Father says, we receive it with due respect, and we judge it in light of Scripture and in light of tradition and in light of the perennial magisterium of the Church, what the Church has always taught. And that way we can keep our balance. We are living in very strange times. So my talk is consequences of ignoring Humanae Vitae, ignoring what God has revealed to us through his vicar. And of course that includes the 2,000 years nearly that went before. A little background. Contraception was regarded as immoral by all Christian denominations up until 1930. And something happened in 1930. The Lambeth Conference of the Anglican Communion reversed its decision, a decision that had been made in the two previous conferences, that is, in 1908 and 1920. And in the conference of 1930, it permitted married couples to limit their families under certain conditions by using contraceptive practices. And we have something similar happening to us today. A decision has been made or has been received as true, and then there's a group, a lobby that comes and wants to change it, and they fail. So they come back 10 years later and propose it and fail. And they come back 10 years later, and in this case it passes. What happened? Because in those intervening years, they were doing their homework. They were speaking to the people who make the decisions. So whether it be theologians, whether it be bishops, whether it be lawmakers, they are there changing the mindset, the way people think, until they have achieved their purpose. We saw it happen in Ireland not so long ago. So the Lambeth Conference permitted contraception under very specific conditions. Well, once you have that in, you can throw away the conditions. It's the same with abortion. Very restricted, only for rape and only for incest, and then the rest follows. So the reaction of the Catholic Church under Pope Pius XI was quick, and he wrote an encyclical, Casti Connubii, in the same year, 1930, in December, in which he reaffirmed the perennial teaching of Christianity, not just the Catholic Church, but Christianity in general. However, a hole had been made, the wall was breached, and all the Protestant denominations followed the Anglican lead and repudiated the teaching over the next 30-odd years, in fact up to present. And so we come to 1960. The world has changed, society is changing, a new age has dawned, and this has been brought about by Hugh Hefner with Playboy magazine, who was normalizing pornography. Alfred Kinsey was rationalizing perversion with his pseudoscientific studies. Margaret Sanger was promoting birth control and eugenic theories. And with this background, there were also concerns about the rapid growth in population, the changed social status of women, and the stupendous scientific and technological advances, all of which led to open debates about marriage and about sex and sexuality. Additionally, and this is what was critical, the advent of the contraceptive pill, the first hormonal non-barrier contraceptive, raised new questions about the Church's perennial teaching on marriage. Was the pill contrary to nature? Is essentially what was being asked. Does it violate the Church's teaching about the marital embrace? Well, the Church, to answer these new questions, the Church, the Pope, set up a 72-member advisory pontifical commission. This was an advisory body consisting of theologians, sociologists, medical experts, and married lay people from a dozen different countries. They produced two reports, a majority report and a minority report. The majority report was leaked so that the impression through the media and so on was the Church would change her teaching. But running counter to the majority recommendation of this commission and sailing against the tide of world opinion as determined by political, financial, and ideological interests, Pope Paul VI, somewhat tardily but with commendable clarity, held fast to the Church's perennial teaching on the regulation of birth. But, as I mentioned, there was a new spirit abroad, a spirit of rebellion. And, not surprisingly, Pope Paul VI felt not only the wrath of the world, but also the stinging rebuke of dissenting cardinals and bishops, the outright objection of some bishops' conferences, and the barbs of rebellious priests and theologians. This attack on Pope Paul VI was so brutal that he never wrote another encyclical. Humanae Vitae was his last. Pope Paul VI was fully aware of the credibility of the Church's perennial teaching with modern sensibilities. And so he made a broad appeal in the encyclical to public authorities, scientists, the medical profession, Christian households, and especially priests and bishops, for cooperation in what he called, and I quote, the truly great work without which man cannot find true happiness, the happiness for which he yearns with his whole being. In his concern for the common good, the Pope also warned of the grave consequences of rejecting Humanae Vitae, which is the fruit, he said, of not only of extensive and prolonged consultation, but above all, of intense and profound prayer. So what was the issue? Contraception is not the same as birth control, and I think it's important for us to recognize this. Births can be controlled in many different ways. Some ways are morally good, such as abstaining from coition, either periodically or permanently, while others, like abortion, are intrinsically evil. However, neither abstinence nor abortion is contraceptive. Contraception is a deliberate act to prevent pregnancy, and it requires a twofold choice. First, the choice to engage in sexual intercourse, an act that is known to be open to the transmission of life. And second, the choice, and I'm quoting Pope Paul, the choice of any action which either before, at the moment of, or after sexual intercourse is specifically intended to prevent procreation, whether as an end or as a means. So we have this twofold choice, the decision to have intercourse, and the second choice is to impede it. It is this latter choice that is morally evil. And it is evil because it is a choice, freely made, to completely destroy here and now the procreativity of a freely chosen act of sexual intercourse. Thus, contraceptive intercourse is not simply non-procreative, meaning that one does not in fact result in pregnancy, but it is actually anti-procreative, inasmuch as it is an attack on the goodness of procreativity of marriage and of human sexuality. It is an act in and through which one denies the goodness of fertility and of sexual intercourse being open to the transmission of life. For this reason, the Church, through Humanae Vitae, teaches firmly that the contraceptive choice is intrinsically evil because it is anti-procreative. It is important to realize that the procreative meaning of human sexuality and of the marital act is not a good of the biological order, which is essentially instinctive and subpersonal. In other words, human sexuality is not like animal sexuality. It's not just a matter of instinct. It is not subpersonal, as in the case of animals. Rather, it is a good of the human person, and consequently of God, the author of our procreativity. The contraceptive choice leads to an ingrained contraceptive mentality that rejects this good of the human person, of human sexuality, and of marriage, and so reduces the marital embrace to what is, in effect, mutual masturbation. Well, the reaction to Humanae Vitae, and I remember it, despite the very vocal ridicule, hostility, and ultimately complete indifference with which Humanae Vitae was generally received, there was substantial and significant support for the authentic Christian teaching on human sexuality. And this support came from many different quarters, not including an editorial in the New York Times and in the Washington Times, of all places. And of course, there were Protestants who also, prominent Protestant pastors and thinkers and so on, who supported the Pope, though of course the voices were not widely broadcast. But its greatest defender and promoter was St. John Paul II, who, in Evangelium Vitae and in Familiaris Consortio, among other writings, developed the magisterial teaching on family and life that is now the flagship of Catholic sexual morality. This year, 2018, marks the 50th anniversary of the publication of Humanae Vitae. The encyclical has both promoters and detractors, and recent calls to review its teaching in light of Amoris Laetitia have brought consternation to the hearts of the former and hope to the latter. In the current climate where Catholic doctrine is being made subservient to a putative pastoral expediency, it is morally certain that any reading of Humanae Vitae through the lens of Amoris Laetitia will result in further compromises with the culture of death, the asphyxiation of the Catholic sexual ethics, and the eviscerating of the Catholic faith. Pope Paul VI gave some warnings about the dangers of ignoring Humanae Vitae. warnings that have been called prophetic. The grand satanic stratagem from Eden to the present day is to deceive, and to deceive by offering, first and foremost, some sane, attractive, wholesome, counterfeit alternative to the divine will and commandments. The arguments that Satan presents are always sensible. Did God really say you can't eat any of the trees? So it's sane, it's attractive. She saw the fruit was good to eat. Wholesome, it'll give you knowledge. Counterfeit, because it goes against the will of God. Contraception, it is claimed, creates a level playing field between the sexes, and the pill in particular liberates women from nature's fertility cycle and endows them with decision-making power and a sexual independence stripped of fear of pregnancy. Well, that sounds reasonable. The potentially deleterious effect on individuals and on society of this sane, attractive, wholesome alternative was foreseen by Paul VI, who, in Humanae Vitae, number 17, and in terms both general and specific, warned of the negative consequences of methods and plans for artificial birth control. Specifically, he warned that artificial birth control would lead to a general lowering of morality, that the man may lose respect for his wife, that there would be government intervention in, quote, the most personal and most private sector of conjugal intimacy, end of quote, and fourthly, that there would be a denial that there is any absolute limit to the human being's dominion over his or her body and its functions. Humanae Vitae arrived at the full flood of the sexual revolution, a revolution whose ascendancy was established with the liberalization of divorce, the pharmaceutical approval of the contraceptive pill, and the legalization of abortion on demand. In challenging the spirit of the age, Humanae Vitae became undoubtedly the most controversial papal document of modern times. So we look and see how the Pope's warnings have in fact come to fruition. The general lowering of morality. Paul VI not only warned about the widespread use of contraception would open wide the way for marital infidelity and a general lowering of moral standards, but also appealed to the common experience which has shown that, quote, human weakness, and especially the young, need incentives to keep the moral law. And it is an evil thing to make it easy for them to break that law. Close quote. So he gave a reason. And this is something that we all know. That it's very easy to break the moral law. It is indisputable that the developed world has seen a catastrophic and widespread decline in morality, especially sexual morality, over the last half-century. This decline is easily verified by the decrease in the number of marriages, which is what the Pope had warned about, and by the increase in the number of people cohabiting, as well as by the number of divorces, abortions, out-of-wedlock pregnancies, and sexually transmitted diseases. It is also a fact that these social ills have their genesis in contraception. For most young men and women, the fear of pregnancy was a great deterrent from engaging in premarital sexual intercourse. But the easy availability of contraception has presented them with a sane, attractive, wholesome alternative, which leads them to believe that they can engage in premarital sexual activity responsibly. Additionally, governments have provided the legislation and the financial structures which make the adoption of a sexually immoral, if not irresponsible, lifestyle easy. So, although abstinence and chastity programs in the Philippines and Uganda have had spectacular success in halting and even reversing the AIDS epidemic, the decadent West has preferred the sane, attractive, wholesome alternative of the safe sex and safer sex mantras, which have merely exacerbated moral decline. With the excuse of protecting children from pedophiles, from contracting AIDS, or from becoming pregnant, sex education programs, some bordering on the pornographic, are used in schools from kindergarten upwards. These not only rob children of their natural innocence, but also induct them into sordid sexual practices. The criminal predatory activities of pedophile priests, pedophile clerics, parliamentarians, teachers, judges, relatives, entertainers also contributed greatly to the moral decline, if only by generating cynicism among the general public. This cynicism is further aggravated by the recent revelations of the immoral, abusive, and criminal practices of highly influential public persons occupying positions of trust in Hollywood, in high government circles, and even in the church. The overall result is that there is no longer a standard bar for sexual morality. And of course, there is a wedge being driven between people. And we've reached in the stage where any man and every man is suspect. The Pope also warned about the loss of spousal respect. He warned that there was a grave danger that a man accustomed to contraceptive practices would regard his spouse as a mere instrument for the satisfaction of his own desires, and, disregarding her physical and emotional equilibrium, deprive her of the reverence due to her as his partner whom he should surround with care and affection. This concern reflects what has come to be known as a personalist understanding of morality, which is based upon the respect for the dignity of the human person. The Church's teaching on contraception is designed to protect the good of conjugal love. When spouses violate this good, they do not act in accord with their innate dignity and thus endanger their own happiness. Treating their bodies as mechanical instruments to be manipulated for their own purposes, they risk treating each other as mere objects of pleasure. And this is not new. St. Augustine addressed this very problem in his treatise, Marriage and Concupiscence, and he writes, 1500 years ago, I am supposing then, although you are not lying with your wife for the sake of procreating offspring, you are not for the sake of lust obstructing their procreation by an evil prayer or an evil deed. Those who do this, although they are called husband and wife, are not, nor do they retain any reality of marriage, but with a respectable name cover a shame. Sometimes this lustful cruelty, or cruel lust, comes to this, that they even procure poisons of sterility. This is 1500 years ago. Contraception, by removing the threat of pregnancy, proposes itself as a sane, attractive, wholesome alternative to the self-discipline required by the natural law. It also crowned men's desire for endless sex with a promise of endless joy, as women are now regarded by men as being always sexually available. Additionally, this sane, attractive, wholesome alternative traded the balance which required men to take at least equal responsibility for an unplanned pregnancy with a power imbalance where now women have the full responsibility for avoiding pregnancy. This brought further disadvantages to women who, in their search for a husband, often ended up with serial partnerships. Contraception in practice, by neutering women, reduced sex to a mere matter of consent, thereby making marriage, courtship, and even romance dispensable. The third warning, government intervention. The Pope also warned that should contraception be seen as a legitimate means for limiting family size, public authorities who care little for the precepts of the moral law would be empowered to apply those same means as a solution to the problems of the community and to impose the use of contraception on its people. The net effect, he warned, would place in the hands of public authorities the power to intervene in the most personal and intimate responsibility of husband and wife. This third warning of Pope Paul VI has been realized with tragic accuracy in both the developed and the developing worlds. With respect to the former, for instance, in a supposed attempt to reduce teenage pregnancy rate, government policies encourage teenagers of all ages to use contraceptives and requires secondary schools to teach their students about responsible sexual relationships, while health authorities operate special teenage-friendly birth control clinics. The result is that younger and younger girls are drawn into the sexual vortex as they are pressured into sex or even raped by more experienced older boys. While government control is subtle in the developed world, it is brutal elsewhere, such as the forced abortion programs of China and India, where only one child or two children per woman, respectively, is permitted. In both those countries, unborn girls have been the primary victims. In the developing countries of Africa, by tying loans and international aid grants to population control policies, governments are pressured to enforce family planning programs on their populations. Not infrequently, and despite the growing evidence that many parts of the world are facing not overpopulation, but rather underpopulation, women are sterilized or fitted with contraceptive devices or drugs without their knowledge or consent. And my brother Greg was in Uganda just last month, and he came in the places, in the various towns they visited, he came across women. In fact, they went with a team of medical doctors. They found women who had been given 2 or 3 different contraceptive devices simultaneously. So it's not just one, but they have 2 or 3 others as well. And the reason? Because the person who is responsible for distributing these contraceptives gets paid according to the number that have been delivered. So there is no care about the health of people, especially of women, but it is a matter of making money. And we have, all of us share that same fallen human nature. So I think we can understand the temptation. The fourth point, prophecy, warning the Pope gave, was there's no limit to dominion over the body and its functions. And this fourth warning is remarkably prophetic. Foreseen while contraception initially claimed that the responsibility of procreating should be left to the arbitrary decision of men, ultimately would be emboldened to deny any reverence due to the whole human organism and its natural functions, and to assert that there are no limits to the power of man over his own body and its natural functions. When we read Genesis, we notice that the angel took to himself the form of a serpent. So once the head gets in, the rest of the beast goes in as well. Once the serpent can get its head into a hole, the rest of the body can go. And that's exactly what we see happening. This final prophecy has been fulfilled with a vengeance. In developed countries, sterilization, both male or female, is perhaps the most widely used form of contraception. But the desire for unlimited dominion over one's own body extends beyond contraception. With the sophism, my body, my choice, failed contraception led to a demand for abortion of the newly conceived child. At the other extreme, the production of test tube babies and the practice of surrogacy were early indications of a mindset that would refuse to accept the body's limitations. And you no doubt remember the case of a 65-year-old woman who went on a fertility treatment so that she could have a child, the child she'd always wanted, at 65. I don't think she realized that when she reaches 80, she'll have a 15-year-old teenager on her hands at 80. Presented as a sane, attractive, wholesome alternative to infertility, the egg and sperm banks soon reduced human procreation, and indeed children, to a marketable commodity. Equally, euthanasia and the use of organs transplanted from those who are nearly dead are not only sane, attractive, wholesome alternatives to palliative care, but also clear signs that all reverence for the human organism and its natural functions has been lost. Going even further, there are individuals who are so convinced that they have absolute autonomy over their bodies, they do not hesitate, not infrequently, with tragic consequences, to alter even their own physiological makeup, creating subclass called transgender persons. This subclass, which endorses the mutilation of healthy bodies, not only facilitates the destruction of masculinity and femininity, but also opens up a Pandora's box of confusion, generating transsexual, transracial, transspecies, transabled, and transomnia subgroups. Thus, Blessed Paul VI's prophecy is tragically fulfilled since, now, with the rejection of the principles of Humanae Vitae, subjective feelings trump objective reality. And some individuals, unable to accept themselves and their bodies with its inherent potentials and limitations, mutilate their body in an effort to align it to their perceived feelings, desires, and even timetables. So, the consequences. Sex has a unique bonding or cementing power between a man and a woman because the sexual instinct is clearly bound up with the whole emotional, affective, and interpersonal life of man and woman. Given this fact, real interpersonal harms and significant possibilities for selfishness and exploitation arise whenever individuals choose to act on this instinct in a context apart from marriage. Indeed, sexual activity is never a reasonable choice in the absence of commitment, particularly a permanent commitment between a man and a woman. This flows in part from the fact that it brings new lives into the world, and those lives are vulnerable and dependent, necessitating a mother and a father who are committed to each other and to the children arising from their permanent union. Over the last 50 years, the acceptance and widespread use of contraception has eclipsed this view and brought about, if not created, a new worldview that exalts the I over the we, the individual's desires over the family's and the community's needs, the strong and powerful over the weak and vulnerable, pleasure over responsibility. It has effectively enacted the law of the jungle for the 21st century. No age has ever sought to abandon the reproductive aim of sexual activity as much as our own. Various polls reflect the fact that our society has yielded to the seductive siren call of contraception, broadly encouraging the separation of sexual intimacy from procreation. A 2013 Gallup poll reported that 91% believe contraception to be morally acceptable. Professor Robert George of Princeton University has noted that marriage is increasingly coming to be understood as an emotional union for the sake of adult satisfaction that is served by mutually agreeable sexual play. Without the self-sacrificing dimension of sex involving the acceptance of new life, individuals are left in the position of amiably using one another. It is perhaps noteworthy that Sigmund Freud, who was no friend of Christian morality and who in his earlier days strongly favored contraception, eventually came to regard the psychological essence of perversion as the severance of the sexual act from its intrinsic relation to procreation. In his general introduction to psychoanalysis, he wrote, I'm quoting, it is a characteristic common to all the perversions that in them reproduction as an aim is put aside. This is actually the criterion by which we judge whether a sexual activity is perverse. If it departs from reproduction in its aims and pursues the attainment of gratification independently, such activity is called by the unhonored title of perversion, and as such is despised. No part of modern society is untouched by the contraceptive mentality, the basis, the essence, and the philosophy of which is sterile sex. Modern society has in practice declared war on fecundity and simultaneously on its own future. The approval of abortion is a patently logical step for the sterile sex mentality. This was already foreseen by Father Paul Marx when he said, while we need a variety of pro-life groups hacking away at the anti-life monster, it is enormously futile and indeed grossly short-sighted to overlook the chief source of baby killing, which is contraception. As mentioned earlier, contraception prevents birth subsequent to making a twofold choice: the choice to engage in sexual intercourse and the choice of an action either before, at the moment of, or after sexual intercourse that will prevent procreation. However, both fertilization and the development of a new person can be prevented. Sterilization is avoided by using methods that prevent the egg and sperm from meeting. Any method employed after fertilization, however, is necessarily abortifacient. These include hormonal drugs, such as the contraceptive pill, the morning after pill, and devices such as the IUD that render the womb baneful to new life, and of course, surgical abortion, which automatically becomes a backup plan, since every contraceptive method, with the exception of sterilization, will sooner or later fail. In a 2017 study, the Brooke Advisory Service found that 2/3 of the women seeking abortion services were using some kind of contraception. According to Dr. Judy Berry, medical advisor and director of Brooke, there is an overwhelming evidence that, contrary to what you might expect, the provision of contraception leads to an increase in the abortion rate. Globally, surgical abortions account for some 50 million deaths annually, and chemical abortions outstrip that number. Studies have shown that globally, 50% of women abort either to postpone childbearing or because they want no more children, 20% because a child would disrupt their life, and 14% because of mother or child health issues. The stark reality is that, globally, less than 6% of abortions are performed for the hard cases, which include rape and incest, and more than 94% to save the mother's lifestyle. The real tragedy is that in modern society, abortion, which is willful murder, is promoted as a choice, defended as a right, and permitted by laws supposedly enacted for the hard cases. In his encyclical, Humanae Vitae, number 58, John Paul II wrote, "The moral gravity of procured abortion is apparent in all its truth if we recognize we are dealing with murder. So whether choice or right, abortion is a consequence of ignoring Humanae Vitae." Sterile sex is at the heart of the contraceptive mentality. Paul VI had warned of the inherent dangers of attacking the inseparable connection established by God between the unitive significance and the procreative significance, which are both inherent to the marital act. Two inherent dangers did, in fact, immediately emerge from separating what God had joined together. The first held that since the use of contraception, that sane, attractive, wholesome alternative, was valid for heterosexual activity, there was no inherent argument against homosexual behavior, which, after all, is sex without babies. We would readily accept babies without sex. So the second, which is contraceptive mentality, with its desire for sex without babies, would readily accept babies without sex. In bringing this mentality to fruition, not only is the child's human dignity and rights violated, but also life in its earliest stages is reduced to merely a commercial and, in some cases, disposable commodity. The sin of Sodom, which is mostly associated with homosexual behavior, is intrinsically sterile sex, which is a form of coition that is naturally not open to the transmission of life. As such, other sodomitic activities would include masturbation, bestiality, necrophilia, and similar sexual deviancies, whose essence is sterile sex. Homosexuality, however, remains a flagship for the sin of Sodom. It is publicly celebrated in many major cities throughout the world, with parades of nude or semi-nude men and women simulating graphic sexual acts. This lifestyle, which not only leads to self-centeredness and a search for pleasure without responsibility, but is also obsessive, psychopathological, and destructive to the body, is now accepted as normal. Yet, even more insidious is the blatant daily promotion of the homosexual lifestyle in the media, in advertising, in education, and scandalously in the church. While the homoerotic, muscular, naked male figure languidly reclining in last year's Vatican nativity scene shows the extent to which homosexual ideation has infiltrated the church, the recent scandals are unveiling the true depth and malignancy of that infiltration. Incredibly, behaviors that just 50 years ago were regarded as perverse, as being contrary to nature, and were illegal, are now promoted as a lifestyle choice and defended as a right. Hence, Cicero's observation is truly appropriate. Corruptio optimi pessima. That is, the worst evil is the perversion of the best. The power of procreation is humanity's best gift for building the civilization of life. But as a consequence of ignoring Humanae Vitae, it has been perverted into the worst evil, a means for advancing a culture of death. Pope Paul warned that contraception would cause damage to the dignity and role of women, to marriage, to children, to families, and to society. Numerous studies have established the existence of a correlation between contraceptive use and the falling marriage rates, the increasing number of divorces, people cohabiting, of single women, of children born out of wedlock. Various studies also show that these groups suffer great disadvantages than married couples. These disadvantages are not necessarily the struggle against material poverty, but also the struggle against emotional and spiritual deprivation arising from the failure of a lifelong commitment or from the consequences of contraceptive cohabitation. And so, in conclusion, having redeemed the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt, guided them through the desert, fed them with manna from heaven, taught them to trust in God, transmitted to them God's will in the Ten Commandments, promised them a prophet like himself to whom they should listen, Moses warned them lastly, saying, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and cleaving to him. For that means life to you and length of days, that you may dwell in the land the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, that he would give them. Deuteronomy 30, 19 and 20. The prophet promised his Christ, the Son of God, who redeems us from our sins by his blood, feeds us with his body, guides and teaches us by his church, against which he promised the gates of hell would never prevail. 50 years ago, Humanae Vitae placed before the world a choice between life and death, and blessings and curse. In rejecting the church's perennial teaching and opting for contraception, the world chose death and the curses that have paved the way to it: enslavement to unruly and deviant sexual passions, flouting of the natural law, and the abandonment of reason, rejection of moral absolutes, murder of the innocent, dissolution of the family, resulting in oppressed women, disillusioned men, dislocated youth, virulent and incurable sexually transmitted diseases, and, since sin has social consequences, aging populations and dying nations. Going beyond simple knowledge of specific doctrines, we ought to accept in faith that the Church's doctrine is both true and good, that God expects us to live in accord with that doctrine, and that any perceived difficulties are surmountable with the help of His grace. Pope Paul VI's defense of the Church's doctrine on contraception in the face of massive opposition is a clear sign of the charism of infallibility in action. It ranks with the vacillating Clement VII's refusal to annul Henry VIII's marriage in the face of all the conventional wisdom of the time regarding papal authority. In both cases, we worship God and fulfill His saving will for us by respecting and by living the objective moral order. Authentic respect for a person means to help him or her embrace this truth, no matter how much sin may have lulled him or her into wrongly thinking that observing God's law is impossible, unnecessary, or undesirable. The papal establishment of a commission to re-examine and re-evaluate Humanae Vitae is viewed with much foreboding by faithful Catholics, who in the current climate fear it as a Trojan horse for sanctioning the use of contraception. This fear arises from various papal utterances, including there are many ways to avoid pregnancy, from his approving the use of contraceptives to prevent pregnancy in areas where the Zika virus is prevalent, and from his inviting abortion advocates and population controllers such as Paul Ehrlich, Jeffrey Sachs, to various Vatican meetings and to various Vatican committees. Further, the description of Emma Bonillo, an illegal abortion provider, a euthanasia advocate, and co-founder of the Information Center on Sterilization and Abortion, as one of Italy's forgotten greats, is as disturbing as his appointment of Rabbi Abraham Steinberg and Professor Nigel Biga to membership of the newly constituted Pontifical Academy for Life. While Steinberg holds that the unborn child has no human status before 40 days, though after 40 days it has a certain status of a human being, though not full status, Biga holds that abortion is permissible before 18 weeks, because it is not clear that a human fetus is the same kind of thing as an adult. Additionally, Father Maurizio Chiodi, moral theologian of the New Academy for Life, presented a public lecture entitled Re-Reading Humanae Vitae in light of Amoris Laetitia at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. In his lecture, he declared there are circumstances, I refer to Amoris Laetitia, chapter 8, that precisely for the sake of responsibility require contraception. End of quote. In such circumstances, he said, an artificial method for the regulation of births could be recognized as an act of responsibility that is carried out, not in order to radically reject the gift of a child, but because in those situations, responsibility calls the couple and the family to other forms of welcome and hospitality. Although Catholic morality holds that the ends do not justify the means and that circumstances do not change the morality of a human act, Father Chiodi believes that an individual or couple jointly can commit the mortal sin of contraception as an act of responsibility and, depending on circumstances, may even be compelled to do so. Here he takes his cue from the inferences in Amoris Laetitia while ignoring the brutal reality of both the of both the abortifacient effect of most commonly used contraceptive methods and the social, familial, and personal devastating consequences of ignoring Humanae Vitae. The news of the establishment of the Papal Commission to review and reevaluate Humanae Vitae, whilst filling the encyclical's detractors with frenzied joy, should also fill faithful Catholics with an evangelical zeal to study, unravel, explain, expound, share, and make known as widely as possible the gospel truths taught by and which over the past 50 years have been verified by the real life experiences of billions of ordinary men, women, and children. Also, needed is prayer that the Holy Spirit, who has guided and protected the Church over these past 2 millennia, will continue to ensure that, despite the howling of the wolves and the weakness and deafening silence of the shepherds, sin will not be institutionalized within the Church. The teaching of nature itself, the natural law of human reason, and the experience of the last half-century all irrefutably affirm that contraception is profoundly harmful, is unnatural, damages marriages, hurts families, gives rise to great social injustices and injuries that ultimately annihilates nations. The stark reality is that sin, and particularly the grievous sin of rejecting Humanae Vitae, has personal, social, and ultimately divine consequences. Thank you.